Hey guys, this is Charles Yeager with RocketStock.com. In this tutorial, we're going to create some Blade Runner inspired eye effects, such as the replicant red eye effect and the blind eyes that are on Jared Leto's character in the new Blade Runner 2049. Let's go ahead and preview both of those examples. The way we accomplish this is by tracking the eye with After Effects track motion feature and then parenting our eye elements to null objects with that tracking information. Using this method, we can also parent other layers such as elements from the interface HUD pack that's available on RocketStock. We're also going to be covering some basic eye compositing tricks, but before we get started, make sure you download the project file for this tutorial, which is going to be available on the RocketStock blog. It's going to include the example footage I'm using today as well as the eye elements. And it's also going to include some HUD elements from the interface HUD pack. Alright guys, inside of After Effects, I've already added my footage here into a composition. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a null object that we're going to parent our tracking data to. I'm going to start with the right eye here. So I'm just going to right click and create a new null object. And I'll just come down here and I'm going to rename this. I'm going to hit enter and just call this I1. Now we need to go ahead and track the eye, and where I'm going to be tracking is right on the pupil, so the black area. And if you'll notice in this particular shot, the reflection, this is one thing you're going to have to watch if you're using your own footage, is if your reflection is directly in the center of the eye, that can mess with the tracker, with the track motion feature. And so it's best to have your light kind of coming from the side. In this case, it's what I've got here. Even with the reflection being that close to the pupil, it should be okay. Now I've already got the tracker panel open over here in After Effects, but if you don't see that, just come over here to Window, and then select Tracker, and that'll open up that panel for you. So I'm gonna go ahead and select my footage, and I'm gonna come over here and select Track Motion. And that's gonna open up a track point. I'm just gonna click in there, and I'm just gonna drag this over the pupil. And I'm gonna zoom in here. And this first area is the actual thing we're gonna be tracking. And so I want this to basically be the same size as the pupil, so just right around that circle there. And the other box is gonna be our track area. So this is where After Effects is gonna look and search for this center point. So you don't want this to be too big. The bigger this is, the longer the track's going to take, but in some cases it can be more accurate. It's just good to focus on something that's kind of contrasty to get a good track. Now one thing we're going to want to do before we actually track this is I'm going to go ahead and move the current time indicator to the very beginning of the clip. That way we're tracking from the beginning. So I'll move this right back into position. And we're probably going to have to go through here and manually do some corrections. That's just kind of part of the game when it comes to using the track motion feature on something like this. And the results are going to be a little bit sporadic, but that's okay with eyes because they move very quick. And so it should look fairly natural, at least for our case here with this example. So once I've got that set up in position, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the play button. And that's going to begin tracking forward. We can see right now the results are looking pretty good. And that looks like it worked pretty well, so I don't think we're going to have to go through and do any manual adjustments. And so what we want to do is we want to parent this tracking information out to the I1 null. And so if we come over here, you're going to see motion target. On default, it's probably already set up to I1, but if you need to edit it, click Edit Target, and you can select that here. And I'm just going to go ahead and click Apply, and apply dimensions X and Y, and click OK. So now we can see that null has moved now to the very center of the eye. And if we want to go ahead and double check this, we can just do a quick RAM preview or scroll through here to see if it is in fact tracking with it. And that looks good to me. So we need to do the same thing for the second eye. So I'm just going to right click over here to create a new null object. And I'm going to call this I2. So I'll just hit enter. And then I'm going to select my footage again and also select track motion. And that'll pop up the tracker. We just need to move this over here to the second eye. This one's a little bit darker because it's in the shadow side. So this may again take some manual adjustments. And I'm actually going to resize that a little bit bigger. And we'll see what kind of results we get from this. Make sure your current time indicator is at the very beginning. And I'm just going to go ahead and click play. And it looked like that did pretty good as well. So I don't think we're going to have to do any manual adjustments there. If we need to, we can always do that a little bit later as well. And for the target here, I want to make sure I edit that target to now be eye number 2. Click OK and click Apply. And apply dimensions to X and Y. Okay. So now we've got both null objects here which looks pretty interesting. And just to make sure those both look correct. All right, that's looking good. Now, just so that we're not looking at these null objects the entire time, I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna turn off the visibility for each one of those, even though they're still there in the background working for us. Now we can go ahead and drag in one of our eye elements. So first I'm gonna start off with the red eye kind of replicant look. So I'm gonna come over here to my eye elements and I'm just gonna bring in the red eye PNG. Now this eye asset is very large, as we can see here, because in some cases you may have someone whose eye is a lot closer to the camera than in this particular shot, so it allows us to scale it and not lose any resolution. So I'm going to select the eye, and for scale, I'm just going to hit S on the keyboard, and I'm going to set this to be 2%, which is pretty tiny compared to what it was. And I'm just going to position this now over the right pupil. And now I'm going to go ahead and select that eye element. I'm going to parent it using the pick whip here to I1. And now if I go ahead and scroll through here, we should see that move with the eye. That's looking good. But we definitely need to do some compositing to make this look a lot more like the replicant eyes from Blade Runner. Right now it looks a little too clean and sterile and definitely too bright. And I'm actually going to hit Control-Shift-H on the keyboard with that layer selected to get rid of those selection guidelines. That way we can see this a little bit easier. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to come down here to the red eye, and under mode, I'm going to set this to be a pin light mode. So that'll change the color of that. And then for the opacity, with it selected, I'm going to hit T on the keyboard for opacity. And I'm going to lower this to around 27%. So now we can kind of see it's looking a little bit more like a red eye effect from a photo. But the edges of it are a little too sharp, and I might actually move that around just a little bit here. And you can move it anywhere you want to because it's still parented to the eye, so it'll still track to the eye. You can see as I move it off, it's still going to move with the eye. So you just want to get this centered up best you can. So I'm going to come over here to the effects and presets, and I'm going to add a Gaussian blur to this. And just drag and drop that on the red eye. And I'm going to increase this quite a bit because that asset is really large, so it may take quite a bit of blurring to actually notice it on the red eye there. So around 150 for this I think will be okay. Now we can kind of see it's getting rid of that sharp edge. And then actually on the render example that I did, I wanted to add a little bit more yellow back into this, so I added a hue and saturation effect. So I'll drag and drop that on the red eye as well. And I just offset the master hue here by about 6 degrees. And you can see it adds just a touch of yellow back into that. And I thought that looked pretty good, kind of matched the composite a little bit better. Now for our second eye, all we need to do is select that red eye and just go ahead and hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate it. And I'm just going to go ahead and select it and move it over above the second eye. And you can see actually, because this eye is in the shadow, the pupil is a little bit bigger because it's just in a darker area. So I'm actually scale that up just a little bit, so maybe like 2.5. I think that's a little big, so maybe like 2.3. I think that looks pretty good there. But what we need to do after we have that in position, we need to make sure we select the pick whip and parent that to I2. And now theoretically, these should both move together for each of the eyes. So that's looking pretty good. Now one other thing you might want to consider if you're compositing on this, if your red eye is on the shadow side like this, you may want to increase the opacity just a little bit. Because in theory, if it's on the darker side, it should be getting illuminated a little bit more, whereas this one on the lighter side will probably be washed out a little bit. If you look at the actual old Blade Runner movie, you can kind of see this in some of the shots. So I might increase this up to like 30% for the opacity just to make that a little bit brighter, again, because it's on the shadow side of the face. Now we can see this track's looking pretty good here on the preview. If you wanted to turn on motion blur for this, you could. You would just select each of these eye elements and turn on motion blur. For me, I'm just going to go ahead and leave that off. Now obviously there's no blinking in this shot, and if there was, you would need to come in here and mask over the red eye whenever the person blinks. However, when we add in the blind eye elements here, we're going to do some masking, so I'll kind of cover that a little bit more. So let's go ahead and add in the blind eye elements. So I'm going to come back over here to the project panel, and the blind eyes, I'm just going to double click on this so we can kind of preview this. The way these were created was just a grayish white circle, and then overlaid was a image from a wide angle lens. You can see these are actual real world environments, and then blurred. And so if you want to create your own, you can. And there's a couple different styles we have here you can choose from depending on your room environment. One may look better than the other. There's also a version that has no texture added on it at all, so you can go ahead and overlay your own if you want to. I'm going to use the version 1 in this tutorial. So I'm just going to come back into my composition, and I'm going to drag in the blind eye element. And with that blind element selected, I'm just going to hit S on the keyboard for scale, and I'm going to scale this down to about 6%. And go ahead and move that over here. I'm going to go ahead and disable both of the red eye effects. That way we're not having to look at those. And I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm just going to put this into place. Sort of around the center. If you look at the blind eyes in the Blade Runner 2049 with Jared Leto, you're going to see kind of a black edge around the eyes, and that's what I kind of did with this. That's why it's feathered the way it is. But you'll also notice that the eye is sticking up above the actual eyelid here, so we're going to need to do some masking. However, the eye right now, default, looks a little too glossy, and we may want to wash it out a little bit more. And one trick I did for that was I'm going to come over here and add a tint effect to it. And I'm just going to drag and drop that on the blind eye elements. And for the map black 2, I'm going to select this. I'm going to change this to be kind of a medium gray. And I'm going to select the map white to just be more of a lighter gray. And I went ahead and lowered the amount to tint to around 60%. And you can see it just kind of washes that out a little bit. And then if you want the overall blind eye to be a little darker, I might add a curves effect to it. And then I may lower that a little bit just in the shadows. So what we can do now is I'm just going to select the blind eye and hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate it. I'm going to select that second copy and move it over the second eye. And for the time being, I'm going to turn the visibility of that one off. And I'm going to select the first one. Now we can go ahead and mask out these areas around the eyelid and lower eyelid. So I'm going to come up and select the pen tool, and I'm going to turn on Roto Bezier. That way it's just a little bit smoother. And I'm just going to zoom in here and kind of click around the eye. And it doesn't have to be exact with this, but you're definitely going to want to make some adjustments. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the mask feathering. So I'm just going to come down here, and for the feathering on the mask, I'm going to set that to be 170. And the feathering is definitely going to be our friend to kind of help hide these areas around the eyelashes. That way it's not quite as visible when there's areas when it gets a little off kilt, especially when we're viewing it, in full resolution this far back. It won't be quite as noticeable and helps hide some of the imperfections. So what we need to do now is we need to select that blind eye layer, and again, grab the pick whip and parent that to I1. And now we go ahead and move around. We should see everything tracking correctly. And so what we're going to want to do is I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the clip. I'm going to turn off the mask visibility so I can just see this a little bit clearer. And so we can see the eyes still coming up above the eyelashes there. So we're going to want to fix that. So I'm going to hit M on the keyboard to bring up the mask. And we're going to see the mask path. And I'm going to go ahead and create a keyframe there for that. And I'm going to toggle back on the mask visibility. And I'm just going to click on the mask, and we can move these points around a little bit to kind of fine tune things. And this is definitely going to be a little bit more manual for these type of corrections, and it will take a little bit more time, probably about 5 minutes or so as you go through here and make these adjustments. I mean, for this type of shot, it's pretty much going to have to be done manually in order for it to look good. But I'll just quickly go through and run through this with this first eye, and we would just repeat the same process for the second eye. So once I've got something that looks pretty good, I'm just going to go through here and move through time and kind of see where things line up. And as I make more adjustments, you're going to see it's automatically going to create a keyframe there for the mask path. And again, taking advantage of that feathering to kind of help mask any imperfections through the process. And just keep going through time. And you can toggle on and off the mask preview there to really see how the results are looking. And I'll go ahead and speed this process up, and you can see me masking through this. So there we go. We can see how this looks now as a result of the masking. And again, you can go through and fine tune this as much as you need to. I might come back through here and actually adjust the feathering. So I'm going to select the mask, hit MM. I can go ahead and dial in the feathering a little bit more to see how that looks. Just kind of blend it a little bit more at the top. The eyelashes are definitely going to be the trouble area. And actually, I think one thing I did on the original composite was I lowered the opacity. So I'm going to go ahead and select the eye element, hit T on the keyboard. I'm going to lower this to 88% and just kind of help blend that just a little bit more. And so for the second eye over here, we would just repeat those steps. So I would come in here, position this into place, And I may need to adjust the scaling on this a little bit. And I would come through here and mask out the eyelids on this as well. So go ahead and speed this part up again. So now we go ahead and see the results of that on the second eye. So that worked out pretty well. Just repeating again the process from the first eye. And what's also pretty cool here, if you want to switch out the eye elements after you've created them, what we can do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to select the first eye element for the right eye over here. And I'll come back over here to the project panel. And if I have another eye that I might want to test out, it's very easy. So I can just come in here with that selected. I'm going to select another element. And I'm going to hold Alt on the keyboard and just click and drag and drop that over that element. And that will automatically replace it. And you're going to see that's a different eye element added in there now. So it's a quick way you can kind of preview different eye elements on there without having to go through the entire process again. I'm going to hit Control Z to actually undo that because I actually like the first element that I added. Now the blind eyes in the new Blade Runner 2049 movie, they had kind of a matte texture to them, so they weren't really reflective that much, but I understand that in some cases you may want it to be reflective, and you may actually want some of the natural eye reflection to show up on top of these assets you add in. And so I'm actually going to select my original footage, and if I go ahead and hit Control D or Command D on a Mac to duplicate it, I'm going to drag that to the very top of the layer stack, and so we can see that reflection right there. And so what you really need to do if you want to actually composite this over your eye element is you'll need to come through here and you'll need to mask and track manually that reflection. And that'll take a little bit of time. I actually did that before this tutorial, and for this particular shot, it took about 3 to 5 minutes. So it's not too terribly long. And what you would do with that, I'm actually going to select it. I'm just going to solo it here really quickly. And I'm going to select the pen tool again here, and I'll just demo the very first part of this. So you can see this actual reflection on the eye, and I would come through here and just click around that reflection. And you can see that right there. I would come down here and I'm going to hit M on the keyboard, and I'm going to set the add right here to be none. That way we can still see everything. And I would check for mask path, and you would need to go through your footage and just track that on that reflection. I'll go ahead and show you a quick time lapse of kind of what that process looked like. So once you finish mask tracking the reflection, you'll be left with a layer that looks something like this, where it's just a portion of the eye, and you can see how that's tracked there. I'll go ahead and solo it so we can see it. I went ahead and rename that layer Reflect, so it's just a reflection of the eye, and you can see how that just tracks along with the reflection in the eye. So what we need to do is we need to isolate just those white areas. So I'm going to unsolo that. So what I would do in this case is I would apply a curves effect on the reflect layer. So I'll just drag and drop curves effect onto the eye. And we need to make this really contrasty again, so we just see kind of the white areas and then immediately black areas. So I'd pull the shadows down quite a bit, and then also pull up the highlights. And so you can see we get a very contrasty look there, but I also want this to just be black and white, so I'm going to actually apply a tint effect onto that as well. So we're just getting these black and white areas, and I'm going to set the mode right here to be add. And again, so we can just see those really bright reflective areas, and you can go ahead and adjust the curves a little bit more to kind of fine tune, dial that in. And it's probably going to help to go ahead and lower the opacity. So hit T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity and lower that. And if we pull back here and kind of look, that's just a way you can kind of add that specular reflection back on the eye layer that you're working with if you do want to. Again, it's very subtle, and when you're looking at it from the full perspective is where that's going to kind of look its best. But again, in this case, with those eyes, I actually like the matte kind of texture that was on them, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and delete it. But that's a way of going about adding the reflection to the eyes if you want to. Now finally, since we already have that tracking data for the eyes, it's very easy to add in other layers and kind of give them a cool look as if they're tracking with the movement of the eyes. And some elements that look really good are the interface HUD elements from RocketStock.com. And so I've got a few of those I'm going to drag in here and just kind of show you how I'd composite those into the shot. So I'm just going to drag and drop in this circle loop. And so we can see that. Now the first thing I want to do with this is I'm just going to kind of move it into place, and I'm actually going to parent it to the first eye, but I'm going to make it 3D. Now if your screen turns black in some cases, come down here and just make sure you select active camera, and that'll ensure that everything looks correct there. So what we can do with this, because this is parented to the eye, if we go ahead and scroll this, you'll see it's kind of moving along with the eye. Now the track won't be necessarily perfect because it's only really moving where the eyeball is moving here, but if we go ahead and move this in Z space, kind of away from the eye, It's going to give this nice kind of parallax effect on everything. I'll just move it back really far. And so those little movements with the eye will kind of make drastic movements on this element layer, so we can see this now. So it's a pretty cool look, kind of like an Iron Man type look, and I'll just move it kind of centered. I'm actually going to come down here, and for the mode, I'm going to set this to be add, and I'm going to hit T on the keyboard and lower the opacity of that element. But something else I found that really makes this shine is because this element's kind of further away from the face, we can add a shallow depth of field effect onto this, and I definitely recommend using the camera lens blur, but just for speed, I'm just going to use a Gaussian blur here. So I'll select the Gaussian blur, apply that to that element, and go ahead and increase the blurriness. And again, this kind of emulates shallow depth of field, and I might come down here and increase the opacity a little bit more, and I might even pull this back even more in Z space. And I'm going to go back over to the project panel, and I'm going to drag in another element, but a quick way to do that and composite it like we did our first element here, I'm actually going to select it and hit Control-D, Command-D on a Mac to duplicate it. And again, with that second duplicated, I'm going to leave that selected, and I'm going to select my code layer up here, and I'm going to hold Alt on the keyboard and just drag and drop that on it. And that just helps us speed up our workflow here because we can see that code layer has already been composited in, it's in 3D, already in an add mode and everything else. I'm actually going to move that forward a little bit in Z space. And since we move this forward in Z space, it's kind of closer to the face. It wouldn't be as blurred if we're kind of following the shallow depth of field look. So I'm going to come back up here to the effects and controls and lower the blurriness on that layer. And I may bring up the opacity on that layer again as well, just so we can see it a little clearer. So let's go ahead and do a quick RAM preview of this. And now we can kind of see how those elements are tracking with the movement of the eyes. Again, just because we have that tracking data, it makes it really easy for us to parent other elements to it and get a pretty pleasing result. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial and picked up a few tips for compositing in After Effects. Make sure you guys check out all of the video element packs that are available on RocketStock.com, which includes the interface pack, which has over 400 HUD video elements. Alright guys, it's been Charles Yeager for RocketStock. Thanks for watching.